Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating journey back in time. We're going to look at how a sudden, devastating geopolitical crisis accidentally triggered a massive cultural revolution. It's a literal chain of events that completely molded the modern world as we know it, fundamentally reshaping how we see art, science, and ultimately ourselves. We're talking about the Renaissance in Europe, the spark and the flame. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's lay out our roadmap for today. We'll start with 1. The European reawakening, then 2. The fall of Constantinople, 3. Trade, wealth, and universities, 4. The printing press revolution, and we'll wrap up with 5. Humanism and Renaissance art.
All right, kicking things off with Part 1, the European reawakening.
So what does the word Renaissance actually mean? Well, literally, it means a revival or a reawakening. And in this context, it specifically refers to the resurrection of ancient Greco-Roman civilization. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't just some minor shift in fashion or architecture. No way. It marked a dramatic, absolute transformation across art, religion, and science that swept right through Europe between the 14th and 16th centuries. Society basically started looking backward to the ancients for answers that they felt had been completely lost. Think about this timeline for a second. After the highly developed Roman civilization collapsed in the 5th century, Europe entered the medieval era. That is a massive 1,000-year gap from 500 to 1500 AD, where the thriving, rapid progress of the ancients essentially just went dark. During that time, basic survival pretty much took precedence over things like science, literature, or structural engineering. It wasn't until the 14th century that this really deep hunger suddenly developed to rediscover all that lost classical knowledge. Now, this massive cultural transformation didn't just spring up everywhere all at once. It started directly in the heart of Italy. And honestly, historically speaking, this makes perfect sense, right? Italians were living quite literally on top of the ruins of the Roman Empire. They were surrounded every single day by the physical remnants of that past glory. So it was the absolute perfect incubator for this cultural rebirth before it rippled outwards to shape the rest of the modern world. Moving on to Part 2. The fall of Constantinople. So you might be wondering, what exactly caused this dramatic transformation across Europe? Like, why did 1,000 years of medieval stagnation suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, just come to an end? It's one of the most fascinating turning points in history. And to find the answer, we actually have to look completely outside of Europe, to a major, devastating disruption. That geopolitical disruption happened in the year 1453. That's the year Muslim Turks conquered the city of Constantinople. For centuries, Constantinople had been the absolute center of commerce. It was the vital, thriving trading hub connecting traditional silk and spice routes between Asia and Europe. So when the city fell, Christian traders in Europe lost their primary access, which dealt a completely crippling economic blow to their vast network. But here's the crazy part. This intense military and economic crisis had a totally unexpected cultural side effect. Scholars who had been living and working in Constantinople were abruptly forced to flee the newly conquered city. And as they escaped westward into Europe, they brought their most prized possessions with them, highly valuable Greek and Roman books rescued directly from the city's ancient libraries. Along with these rare manuscripts, they actively promoted the Greek and Latin languages that were strictly required to read them. So, completely by accident, these fleeing scholars essentially seeded Europe with the exact classical knowledge needed to trigger an intellectual explosion. Which brings us to Part 3, trade, wealth, and universities. You see, before the fall of Constantinople, European trade had already been expanding heavily since the 12th century. This created highly developed commercial hubs in Italy, like Venice, Genoa, and Florence. And this booming trade created a brand new, incredibly wealthy merchant class. These were folks who suddenly had the two crucial things required to push culture forward: leisure time and massive disposable income. The immensely rich Medici family in Florence is the perfect example here. They became major patrons, using their immense banking wealth to directly sponsor local independent artists. They essentially acted as the primary financial engine for the entire Renaissance. And check out how this builds. Toward the end of the medieval era, major university powerhouses were firmly established across Europe. Places like Bologna and Padua in Italy, Paris in France, and Oxford and Cambridge over in England. With the sudden influx of new wealth and new ideas, these institutions underwent a massive shift. Instead of just studying scriptures and theology, they began championing classical literature, history, and drama. They used those exact ancient texts brought over by the fleeing scholars for deep academic research, formally resurrecting the knowledge of the past.
All right, Part 4, the printing press revolution.
Now, here is the ultimate game changer. Up until Johannes Gutenberg invented his printing press, every single book at those universities had to be painstakingly copied by hand. Just imagine that for a second, a dedicated monk spending months or literally years just to copy out one single text. That sheer physical bottleneck meant knowledge was fiercely restricted, incredibly slow to spread, and practically limited only to a very specific elite social group.
So, the ability to suddenly make thousands of copies of a book in a short period of time, it was an absolute revolution. Seriously, think of it like the invention of the internet, but for the 15th century. By breaking the bottleneck of hand copying, Gutenberg's press fundamentally democratized information. It allowed the newly rediscovered Greek and Latin classics to spread like wildfire across the continent, scaling the Renaissance to heights it simply could never have reached otherwise.
And finally, Part 5, Humanism and Renaissance Art.
With the printing press pumping out books at unprecedented rates, learning Greek and Latin literally became a high society fashion trend across Europe. This huge expansion in learning directly created brilliant new modern scholars who drew deeply from classical inspiration. The rigorous study of this ancient literature birthed legendary writers that we still revere and study today, right? People like Dante in Italy, William Shakespeare in England, and Erasmus in France. But it wasn't just about literature. There was a profound philosophical shift happening too, known as humanism. Before the Renaissance, education and thought were almost entirely dominated by theism, the overarching concept that the divine is supreme and human life is essentially just a waiting room for the afterlife. Well, humanism completely broke out of those strict confines. It shifted the intellectual spotlight squarely onto mankind. Scholars began intensely studying the history, the worldly affairs, and the raw artistic potential of human beings right in the present moment.
Just look at this stark contrast in the art world to really see the difference. Before the Renaissance, art was completely church-sponsored. It focused strictly on religious themes just to inspire devotion, and the artists themselves were largely anonymous, faceless craftsmen building massive cathedrals without any personal recognition. But during the Renaissance, boom, art exploded into worldly, secular themes. Independent artists finally stepped out of the shadows to proudly display their individual skills, explicitly signing their names to their work. Sponsored by the wealthy elite, the objective shifted toward inspiring true artistic appreciation, openly celebrating the individual rather than just the divine. So let's wrap this up with a thought. The entire Renaissance happened simply because a society chose to look backward. They actively decided to rescue and revive the sunken, forgotten knowledge of an ancient civilization. So I'll leave you with this final question. If studying the distant past triggered the profound revolution of the Renaissance, what future could studying our past unlock for us today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I will see you next time.